and thousands of troops. John?
David Martin at the Pentagon, thank you. As we look back on 1 year of war in Ukraine, we also look ahead to the next phase of the conflict and how it will impact international relations between the West, Russia, and beyond. Joining us now is former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and CBS News contributor John Sullivan, and former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, John Herbst, who is in Ukraine's capital. Ambassador Herbst, President Biden's visit to Ukraine was a sign to Ukraine that they are not forgotten. But I wonder, the president's declaration that Russia has committed crimes against humanity, is that a message that goes even further? In other words, Ukrainians won't be forgotten. The brutality they're suffering won't be forgotten even after the fighting ends.
Well, it's a statement, you might say, of fact, because not only have Russian troops committed massive war crimes, the Russian media has spoken of Ukrainian identity as something that needs to be destroyed, which is why some scholars call this a genocide. And the Russians have been kidnapping Ukrainian children and raising them in Russia as Russians. So the war crime is substantial, and Biden calling attention to it is entirely proper.
Ambassador Sullivan, Vladimir Putin said in his State of the Nation address, quote, "Those who have embarked on the path of betrayal of Russia must be held accountable under the law." It sounded like, well, it is a threat, obviously, but is it a threat born of fear that he might be losing some support at home?
Yeah, John, I think it's desperation. President Putin started his remarks that you cite by saying it was difficult times for Russia. He concluded his remarks by doubling down and saying it's very difficult times for Russia. Those are remarks that were delivered by a man who was under stress, whose special military operation has failed, and he is declaring total war. He's all in. He's putting himself, his country, his people all in support of this special military operation.
Ambassador Herbst, you are there in Ukraine. What is the residue of President Biden's visit? And on the Republican side in America, there are some skeptics of continued support for Ukraine. Some of them include former President Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. Does any of that filter into Ukrainian life as they are concerned about how long the U.S. will be supporting them?
There is still a great deal of satisfaction with Biden's visit. It was seen as a remarkable symbol of ongoing American support. But that's a satisfaction that will fade in the weeks to come unless Biden shows determination to provide Ukraine the weapons that would enable them to inflict a major defeat on the Russians this year. If we send the long-range fires, the attack missiles, which can go 300 kilometers, if we send F-16s and A-10 warplanes, if we send tanks in quantity and on time, the Ukrainians can inflict a major defeat on the Russians in the south of Ukraine. But the administration is rather timid in doing this.
Ambassador Sullivan, give me your assessment of the sanctions so far on Russia, the impact they've had on daily life, and what the next year might look like in terms of whether they will bite in the way the administration hopes they will.
Well, Putin in his speech earlier this week, John, tried to put the best possible face on it, said, we Russians are tough. We've absorbed the worst that the West can do to us with sanctions, and we're carrying on. In fact, the sanctions have had a significant impact on the Russian economy. The Russian economy shrank last year, and the sanctions the bite of both sanctions and export controls will get more significant over time. So Putin himself has said early on that you can't cut Russia off from the global economy. But in fact, now with his remarks earlier this week, he himself is seeking to isolate Russia, urging wealthy Russians to return home, invest in their homeland, and basically creating a fortress Russia as he tries to rally his country to go to victory in this war, which right now he's losing.
Ambassador Herbst, what is your assessment of the rest of the coalition? President Biden paid that personal visit, and then he went and talked to NATO and talked about democracies defending freedom and that Ukraine and support for Ukraine was a symbol of that. What is your feeling about the sense of whether he's got European nations behind him and that they are as fulsome as President Biden is?
The U.S. has done a good job. President Biden has done a good job at putting together the coalition, which includes all of our NATO allies, plus partners in the EU and elsewhere. In fact, the countries in Eastern Europe, the countries that border Russia, think correctly that U.S. policy should be stronger. It's the countries to the west of that aren't as clear-eyed about the danger that Putin poses to their interests and to American interests. And in fact, I think that we need a better job by the administration explaining to the American people that we have a vital interest in stopping Putin in Ukraine, because if Putin wins in Ukraine, we have to worry about greatly increasing expenditures in NATO and perhaps even sending American troops to defend NATO allies like Estonia or Latvia.
Ambassador Sullivan, as a final question to you, Ambassador Herbst talked about Putin if he wins in Ukraine. What if Putin loses in Ukraine? I mean, what does that look like? And do you have a concept of what that looks like? And is that something that Vladimir Putin, as you understand him, would tolerate, losing?
For Putin, it's unthinkable. His remarks that he delivered earlier this week indicate it's just unthinkable. The speech was littered with urging his country on to victory. Victory, victory, victory. That's what he kept talking about. The idea of a defeat in this war is unthinkable for him. And from my perspective, John, Putin is in a position that's difficult for Americans really to understand. I think back to 1968. After the Tet Offensive, when Lyndon Johnson decided this war that he had escalated in South Asia was going now very badly, and he wasn't going to run for re-election, and he was going to retire to the LBJ ranch. Putin can't do that. Putin doesn't have the option of not running for re-election and retiring to his billion-dollar palace in Sochi. He's all in because his life depends on it.
Ambassadors